Hello, my name is Scott McQueen. I'm a member of the Dene First Nation from the Northwest Territories. My family's traditional area is the Tolson River. That's on the south shore of Great Slave Lake. The Tolson River runs parallel to the Slave River and empties into the south shore of Great Slave Lake. For thousands of years, my ancestors have lived in this area. My grandmother, Mary Louise King, was born on the Tolson River in a caribou hide teepee in 1901. My dad, Danny McQueen, we called him Papa, a name that my daughter gave him. He was born on the Tolson River in 1931. And my mother, Annie Doris McQueen, my daughter called her Mama, she was born in a log cabin on the Tolson River in 1941. My family, to survive, we had to hunt, fish, and trap. We hunted caribou, moose, buffalo, and we used the hides from these animals to make clothing and also to use for shelter to make teepees. We fished, we fed fish to our families and our dogs, and my ancestors also trapped. They used the furs from the animals to make warm clothing to survive the cold winters and also to sell to the fur traders to generate income. To use to buy staple goods like flour, lard, salt, rifles, and ammunition. My family was living on the Tolson River, hunting, trapping, and fishing. But to do this, they needed the assistance of dogs. They wouldn't have been able to survive and thrive in the north without the help of sled dogs. These dogs that they used, they were different than most dogs you see today. They were often crossbred with wolf, and they were big, husky dogs with thick fur, so they could withstand temperatures down to -40, just waking up in the morning and shaking the frost off and being ready to head out onto the trail again. The food that these sled dogs ate was the animals that the trapper hunted. Again, the caribou, the moose, and the buffalo, and also different variety of fish that the trapper would catch in his nets that he would set under the ice. These dogs were really important to northern people's survival. If you had a better team of dogs, you could travel further each day, and you would encounter more animals. You would be able to hunt more animals and have a better amount of food, more quantity of food, a variety of food. If you could travel further each day, you would also encounter more fur pelts. You would catch more furs in your traps, and you would be able to have more extra income to buy the extra things in life, like spare rifles, different kinds of clothing, maybe a feather blanket from the trading post. So the use of sled dogs was very important to northern people. My family, most of them were trappers, and so they would head out into the bush at the start of the winter and spend the whole winter out in the bush looking for animals to catch. All northern people who traveled in the Northwest Territories in the wintertime had to make a choice of which method they would use to travel. You could walk with snowshoes, but that was very time-consuming and very hard on the person. So the other alternative was to use sled dogs to travel. It was a lot quicker, and you could cover a lot more ground during the day. So anybody who was traveling in the Northwest Territories, whether it was RCMP, priests, the game wardens, the fur traders, the mail delivery was brought to the Northwest Territories by dog team. So anyone who wanted to move around in the wintertime would have to be able to either train a good team of dogs or at least be able to drive a team of dogs. Sled dogs were so important for northern people that in 1955 in Yellowknife, the Yellowknife Fish and Game Association decided to start a race to see which trapper had the best dog team. So they put together some prizes. They had $50 for first prize. Second prize was a carton of groceries from Hudson's Bay Company, and third prize was a sack of flour from Weaver and DeVore. In 1955, they attracted 13 teams. The winner that year was Alfred Belangeau from Deda. Now, the race was so successful that the Yellowknife Fish and Game Association, they wanted to make it more of a national race. They wanted to have the race to have Canadian significance. They wanted to attract teams from further away than just the Great Slave Lake. They wanted to attract teams from major centers like Fort Simpson or Arctic Red River near Inuvik. So to do this, they had to increase the prize money. So that they started fundraising and came up with $500 for first prize for the 1956 Dog Derby. Word spread around the Northwest Territories of this huge prize money. A trapper might make maybe $1,000 all winter long trapping in the 1950s. And so this was huge prize money for northern trappers. All the trappers around Great Slave Lake were really excited about this prize money, and many of them decided to come to Yellowknife to compete in the 1956 Dog Derby. My Uncle Ray Beck was one of those dog racers, one of these trappers that decided in 1956 to travel to Yellowknife for the Dog Derby. But to travel for the Tolson River trappers was, the decision to travel to Yellowknife was a big decision. They're trapping up the Tolson River. It's 3 days travel from their trap lines just to get to Roche River on the south shore of Great Slave Lake. Once they get to Roche River, they have to decide how they're going to cross Great Slave Lake. They can go straight across the lake, but it's very dangerous, especially if the wind comes up. And that's about an 80-mile trip. That's going to take them quite a few hours, maybe 8-10 hours of travel to get across there. The other option was to travel along the lakeshore, and that was about a 100-mile trip, but it was much safer because they could travel along the trees. And so that 1956, my Uncle Ray, he traveled to Roche River and then made the 2-day trip to Yellowknife. Halfway, they would stop and make a fire and put their feather blankets next to that fire, and they would sleep there that night. The next day, arriving in Yellowknife to compete in the Dog Derby. So 1956, my Uncle Ray had quite a good race. He came in 3rd place in the Dog Derby. That year, the Yellowknife Dog Derby was won by Philip Goulet from Dilo. 1956, my Uncle Ray returned to Yellowknife to compete in the Dog Derby again. That year he won, come in 1st place. And for the next 3 years after that, my Uncle Ray Beck won the Dog Derby again. He had 4 consecutive years, and 1961, Ray was in a really close race. He returned to the Dog Derby, and the way the Dog Derby worked back then is it was 40 miles of racing, and they would go out 20 miles out onto Great Slave Lake and loop around and come back. And so they did that year, 1956 or 1961, sorry. And Ray and Joe Toby were really close together. When it comes down to the finish line, both of the trappers were running next to their dog teams, running for the finish line, and Joe Toby narrowly beat out my Uncle Ray. 1962, Uncle Ray came back with a vengeance and reclaimed his title in the Yellowknife Dog Derby. But by 1962, they'd increased the distance to 2 days, 2 50-mile heats, and for a total distance of 100 miles. In 1962, when Uncle Ray was up at Yellowknife winning his 5th Dog Derby in 6 years, my dad was back at the Tolson River up at Piscataway Lake, and he was training a new team of dogs. About every 8 years, the trapper would have to train a new team of dogs to replace his older dogs, his older aging dog team. And so that was what my dad was doing in the spring of 1962. He was training his younger dogs behind the older ones, and the younger dogs would run behind the old dogs and watch their behaviors and learn the different jobs they had to perform. Now my dad, he liked to train these young dogs in the springtime because they would learn all the different conditions they would encounter in the winter, whether it be glare ice, sometimes they might have to run through overflow, sometimes they're running on bare ground, or at times they even have to swim into open water and swim through it. So the springtime, these young dogs would encounter all these different conditions. So my dad, he's training these dogs. They're hunting. It's springtime, so they're doing a spring hunt for beaver and muskrat, and also he wants a variety of food to eat. So he's hunting for ducks and geese as well. But when he shoots one of these ducks or geese and they don't die, they're just wounded. This dog team would chase after them, and it would usually be the dog that he called Speed. He would reach out while they're in full run, and he would grab the bird by the neck, and one bite he would kill him. And so my dad, he didn't mind that behavior. He started to make a special sound. He would go "ssk" whenever there was an animal around, and his dog team would get really excited because they knew that they would get to chase something. And so that's how he trained this young dog team: Robin, Sandy, Dempsey, Tony, and Speed. Now, once these young dogs learned his route through the bush, they would replace the older dog team, and so that's what they did. My dad gave his older dogs to his dad. He needed a younger team. His dogs were way too old to travel anymore, and so then the young dogs, they took over. They were his new trapline dog team, and so each week he would head out to check and see if he caught any furs. Now, on this first trip that he was going around his trap line, this young dog team, they could hear something in the trap, and they got really excited. They started to run as fast as they could toward the trap, and when my dad could see it, there caught in the trap was a lynx. And before he could do anything, this young dog team, they were dragging him right to the trap, and he flipped his toboggan sideways. He tried to let the snow collect in front of the curl of his toboggan, but it's in the fall time, there's not much snow, and he couldn't stop the dogs. When they got to the trap, they started fighting with this lynx. And my dad pulled out his rifle, but before he could do anything, he was looking for an opportunity to shoot, but he couldn't. He might hurt one of his dogs. And the dog that he called Speed reached in and he grabbed that lynx by the throat, and he hung on and he killed him. So my dad said after that, each time that he caught a lynx, this young dog team, they would do the same thing. They would want to fight with it. And the other dogs, Robin, Sandy, Tony, Dempsey, they would distract the lynx and take his attention away. And Speed would wait for the opportunity, and he would jump in there and he would grab that lynx by the throat and kill him. And my dad said that would take him just a few seconds. And this went on all winter long, but somewhere along in the winter, this young dog team, they dragged my dad to one of the traps, but in the trap there was a wolverine, not a lynx. And this young dog team, they'd never seen a wolverine before. So they dragged my dad right to that trap. He couldn't stop them. And the other dogs distracted the wolverine, took his attention away. Speed jumped in there and grabbed that wolverine by the throat, and he hung on and he killed him. And so my dad, he was really impressed that he had a really tough, strong young dog team. So all winter long, they traveled on this trap line on the Tolson River. In the springtime, a lot of the hunters from Roche River would go hunting caribou together. They would travel together because they would share the same trail. And the guy with the best dog team, he would lead the way. He would be breaking trail for all the other trappers to follow. But before they left on this hunting trip, they would stop. They would talk about a halfway point where they were going to stop and make tea and have a fire camp. And so they did that. They discussed this, and it was maybe 8 or 9 trappers were all heading out hunting together. They headed off to north of Roche River to a place where they'd heard there was some caribou, and they traveled a few hours. They got to the spot, and what would happen whenever these trappers, they discussed making a fire camp, each one of them, they would try to rush as fast as they could to that spot they talked about stopping, and they would quickly use their snowshoe to clear away all the snow. They would make a fire there, they would scoop snow into their tea pail, and they would put that on the fire, and then they would break some spruce boughs and put spruce boughs around that fire. And they would want to be sitting there drinking a hot cup of tea when the next dog team came. And that was like the ultimate insult you could have to another trapper, is to be sitting there with a hot cup of tea and before he even gets to the fire camp. And so that's what my Uncle Ray, he was trying to do that. He took off and he was trying to leave everybody behind on this caribou hunt. He had the championship dog team at that point. And but my dad, he was right with him with his young dog team, with his young dogs, and Ray couldn't leave him. They both got to the fire camp and they made fire. There was another guy named Lawrence Casway, and he was following quite a ways behind, and he was falling back a fair ways. So he started chasing his dogs. He was getting on their case. He was pushing and trying to get them to go faster, so he didn't fall too far back and have these guys sitting there drinking their tea when he got to that fire camp. And I guess he put so much pressure on his lead dog that when he finally got to the fire camp, that lead dog, he jumped into the soft snow and he just started digging, and he dug himself right underneath the snow. So my dad, he looked over at Lawrence and he said, "What are you trying to do, Lawrence? Sneak by us?" And all the trappers around the fire, they had a big laugh. And that was my dad's sense of humor. He always had a timely joke like that. Then they left the fire camp and they headed off again looking for caribou. And it didn't take Ray too long before he stopped and he said, "Snow's too deep, guys. Somebody's going to have to put on snowshoes." That was the other option for these trappers. If one of the dog teams couldn't make a trail through the soft snow, one of the trappers would have to put on snowshoes and walk ahead of the dogs. But none of the guys wanted to do that. So my dad, he says to Ray, "I'll try my young dogs. I'll let them break trail for a while." And so he passes by Ray's champion team, and he said that his young dog team, the snow was about up to their chests, and they kept leaping through that soft snow and basically flattening it out with their whole bodies. And after a while, they come onto the hard pack road. Now the caribou around the Tolson River, they would travel in huge herds, and they would make hard pack roads through the bush. And this young dog team found one of those hard pack roads, and they started running as fast as they could along there. And it wasn't long before they come out onto a lake, and in the middle of the lake was the herd of caribou. Then this young dog team went running right into the middle of that herd of caribou, and they were lunging at the caribou like they were a wild pack of wolves. So now my dad, he's pretty impressed with his young dog team. You know, they had outperformed Ray's championship dog team there on this caribou hunt. And so in 1963, he decided that he was going to take this dog team to Yellowknife to compete in the dog derby. But the food that they ate was the fish, coney or trout, but the trappers from the Tolson River, they like to have red meat for their dogs to eat as well. And my dad had lots of beaver meat to feed to the dogs, but he wanted buffalo as well. And so he went up to Jim's Prairie up the Tolson River. And it didn't take him long to find a big bull buffalo on the edge of the prairie. So he pulled out his rifle and he shot that buffalo, but he didn't kill him. And the wounded buffalo went running into the bush to try to escape. My dad's dogs, instinctively, they took off chasing after this wounded buffalo, and he took his rifle and he dropped it into his toboggan, and then he just grabbed on. And he said they were flying through the bush, and it was really rough because the buffalo was making big holes in the snow, and the toboggan was going back and forth over these holes. He was banging into the trees, and there was lots of snow. It was late in the year. It was March, and the spruce trees were full of snow. The snow was falling on him inside of his toboggan. He could hardly see anything. And all of a sudden, he comes out of the bush and onto a little pond. And there facing him was this wounded buffalo who decided he was going to turn and fight rather than run. So when the dog team, when Sandy, the lead dog, come out of the bush, that buffalo charged my dad's dog team, and he picked up Sandy with his horns and he threw him to the side. And by this time, Dempsey was right underneath this wounded buffalo. And my dad, he grabbed his rifle out of his toboggan, but when you shoot a gun, it gets hot. And he threw it into his toboggan, and all of the snow falling on it, it caused the gun to freeze up. But luckily for my dad, he was a good trapper, and he had extra weapons. He had extra rifles. And they used to keep their rifles in a gun coat like this here. And so he pulled out his spare rifle out of the gun coat, and he shot that wounded buffalo, and he saved himself and his dog team that day. Derby. But by 1963, the dog derby had increased to 2 days of 50-mile heats, 50 miles each day. And the first day of racing, there's a big storm, a whiteout storm. The trappers are getting lost out on the lake, and one of the guys, Zang Lafferty, he didn't make it back at night. And so I asked my dad, what did the race organizers do? You know, I'm thinking in modern terms where they send out search and rescue and have a big search party to go out and find him and bring him home. But my dad, he just looked strange at me, and he said, The race organizers didn't do anything. They knew Zhang was good in the bush. Everybody went home and went to sleep, and in the morning when the storm cleared up, Zhang came home. He just tipped his toboggan sideways against the wind and climbed inside that toboggan, put his dogs in front of the opening, and that's where Zhang and his dog team spent the night on Great Slave Lake. But of course he didn't come back till the morning, so his race was over. But 1963, there was another guy named Isidore Sangri from Dilo. He had a really good dog team as well. And the way they would run the race is they would go out 25 miles out onto Great Slave Lake, and loop around and come back. And so that's what they did, day 2 of the 1963 Dog Derby. And by the time they were looping around and heading for home, it was just my dad and Isidore leading the way. And Isidore, he looked over at my dad and he said, "Well, Danny, here we are halfway and I'm right next to you." And my dad, he said, he looked back at him and he said, "Not for long." And he went, "Sk, sk," and his dogs started running as fast as they could because they thought they were chasing an animal. And so he wound up leaving Isidore behind there. And once he left Isidore quite a ways behind, he stopped making that sound and his dogs thought the animal got away. So they settled into a more leisurely pace, and they went on to win the 1963 Dog Derby. So first prize for the 1963 Dog Derby was this trophy here, in addition to the $500, and also it included a trip for my dad and his family to attend the 1963 Calgary Stampede as a celebrity guest. So my dad, he used his $500, he bought a new freighter canoe, a 20-foot freighter canoe and a 7.5 horse kicker for the back of it. He was so proud of his new equipment that he was just flying full blast back and forth past the community of Roche River. And all the old people in the community, they were so mad at my dad. They were saying, "Look at that Danny out there with that big kicker. He's going to kill somebody." So in July 1963, my dad, he loads his family, my mom, my 2 older sisters, my older brother, his 5 dogs, and 4 or 5 45-gallon drums for fuel that he was going to buy in Yellowknife. He loads all that into his 20-foot freighter, along with a canvas wall tent, because he's bringing his family along and he wants to have a nice home for them while they travel. And so they head across Great Slave Lake in his freighter canoe. They arrive in Yellowknife in July. And from Yellowknife, they load the dogs into the back of pickup trucks. And my family, they get in the front of these pickup trucks and they head down the Mackenzie Highway, which was still being constructed in 1963. Some of the places are so rough along this new highway that bulldozers have to pull the trucks through. And after a long, tough journey, they finally arrive in Calgary. So the race organizers, Stu DeMelt and Smokey Heel, they drop my dad and his family off at a downtown Calgary hotel. And they take the dogs to where they're going to be staying. That evening, they pick up my dad and they tell him, "Danny, let's go feed your dogs." And they drive him right down to the Calgary Zoo. And there in the cage at the Calgary Zoo was my dad's dog team, his harnesses, his toboggan, and in the very next cage was the cage with the lions. And my dad said those lions, they didn't like his dogs. They were just roaring at his dogs. And I said, "What did your dogs do?" And he said, "They roared right back. The hair was up on the back of their necks and they were ready to tackle the biggest lynx they'd ever seen." So that was 1963, my dad's first dog derby. In 1964, the year I was born, my dad again decided to travel to Yellowknife for the dog derby. But this year he did it a little bit differently. Instead of traveling in 2 days and staying, making a fire camp along the lakeshore, he decided that he was going to travel straight across the lake. It was a nice clear day, a very sunny day, and one of my cousins, Richard Beck, was just a young boy, maybe about 12 years old. He was going to travel with his Uncle Danny to Yellowknife across Great Slave Lake. And like I said, it's probably about an eight-hour journey across the lake, and they left Roche River. They traveled for hours, and it was going good at first, but a big storm picked up. The wind started to blow. And after a while, they couldn't see anything. They couldn't see the shore. They couldn't see anything around them. And my dad, he depended on Sandy. Sandy was a smart dog, and he knew his direction so well. And so my dad kept traveling through this whiteout storm. every once in a while he would stop and he would go back to Richard and see if he was okay. And Richard, he started to get really worried. He was saying, Uncle Danny, I think Sandy's lost. He might have turned out onto the lake, and we're going to get lost here. We can't continue like this. And my dad reassured him a couple of times, no, Sandy's a smart dog. He knows where he's going. But with Richard being unsure of where they're going, my dad finally lost confidence in Sandy, and so they put the teams in a circle. And they had feather blankets. They each just climbed into their toboggans and they covered over with their feather blanket. And they spent the night there on Great Slave Lake. Early in the morning, when they opened their blankets, there was the trees that Sandy was heading for a few hundred yards ahead. If they would have let him travel maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, they would have got to the trees and been able to make a nice camp. But 1964, my dad went on to win his second dog derby. This is the trophy that he received for the 1964 dog derby. At this point, the race had increased to 3 50-mile heats. Now, 1965, these dogs that my dad and the other trappers around the Tolson River are using, once they've done a trip once or twice, they remember it. Like my dad, when he used to travel between the communities of Fort Resolution and Roche River, he would do it at night, and he would climb into his toboggan and cover over with his blankets. And when the toboggan stopped moving, he knew he would be at the next community. So, they had so much confidence in these dogs. And these dogs would learn to think and help the trapper in his thinking. So by 1965, Sandy and the rest of the dogs, they knew this trail to Yellowknife and the dog derby route really well. So well, in fact, that the first day of racing in 1965, when my dad got to the finish line, it took him only 3 hours and 55 minutes to complete the 50-mile course. And most other trappers were doing it in maybe about 5 hours before that. So he knocked more than an hour off the fastest time. And when he got to the finish line, there was no race judges. There was no spectators. There was only one man, that was his friend, Stu DeMelt. And so Stu, he liked to smoke, and so he took out his cigarette pack and he wrote down the time that my dad crossed the finish line. And then they loaded the dogs into the back of Stu's truck, and they jumped into the front and waited for the next team to arrive. Well, while they were waiting, some of the race judges and spectators started to arrive at the finish line. And when the first team started to approach, or what they thought was the first team was approaching the finish line, there was a buzz in the crowd. Somebody's beating Danny McQueen. It's not Danny McQueen coming in first. But then my dad jumped out of Stu's truck and he said, no, I've finished already. And the race judges had to check all of the checkpoints to make sure he completed the whole 50-mile course, which of course he did. And I wound up setting a record time for the 1965 dog derby. And he received this trophy here for his efforts, along with, I think at that point, the prize money had increased to $650 for first prize. By 1966, one of the other competitors in the dog derby was a guy from Fort Smith named Gordy Mason. Now, all of the other competitors in the dog derby were trappers, except for Gordy. Gordy was employed by the government of the Northwest Territories as a fish and game officer. And he had the pick of all of the government dogs that were being raised and trained in Fort Smith. But every year he would travel to Yellowknife, and either my dad or my Uncle Ray would beat him in the dog derby. And so word started to spread around that the government was kind of embarrassed that they were always being beaten by these trappers coming out of the bush with only 4 or 5 dogs. And so in addition to all the dogs they had at their disposal in Fort Smith, rumor was going around that they went to Saskatchewan and Manitoba. They bought more dogs, better dogs. They were going to come to Yellowknife, and this year they were going to win the dog derby. And so my dad, he was so nervous that he said that he was even contemplating not racing that year in the 1966 dog derby. But Stu came up with an idea. He said, Danny, Ray's wife is sick with TB. She's in Edmonton. Let's borrow Ray's best dogs and combine them with yours, and you'll have a really good team for this dog derby. But Ray's dogs, they were down in Fort Resolution, and my dad was already in Yellowknife at this point. But they had a highway, and so Stu, he says, let me send my boys, Michael and Leonard. They'll go down to Fort Resolution. They'll get Ray's dogs and bring them back. But while the boys were getting ready to go, Stu said he overheard them, and they were talking about bringing their girlfriends. And he knew if they brought their girlfriends, it was going to take them a long time to make that trip. So he came up with a plan. He took the back seat out of their car and he told the boys that that's where the dogs had to go. He confided in me that he only did that so they couldn't bring their girlfriends. And it worked great because those boys, they went right down to Fort Resolution. The next day, they were back in Yellowknife with 2 of Ray's best dogs. And my dad combined those with his team and went on to win the 1966 Canadian Championship Dog Derby, received this trophy here along with his prize money. In 1967, my dad returned to Yellowknife to compete in his 5th consecutive dog derby. At that time, no other teams from outside of Yellowknife traveled to Yellowknife to compete in the dog derby. The Roche River, or the Tolson River Huskies as they were called, were such a strong breed of dogs that they gained a reputation as being almost unbeatable. And so teams from outside of Yellowknife weren't willing to make the long, tough journey into Yellowknife to try to compete against these Roche River teams. So 1967, my dad, there was only 6 or 7 other teams that competed, all from the Yellowknife area, and my dad didn't deem there to be a lot of competition, so he put his feather blanket inside his toboggan and he sat inside for the entire 150-mile course and went on to win his 5th consecutive dog derby. He got this trophy right here for winning the 1967 dog derby. He returned in 1968, but by 1968, the format of the dog derby had changed. It was changed from a 150-mile marathon that suited these trappers that had really tough dogs, and it was shortened down to, I think it was a 30-mile dog sled race. But in addition to that, it was run in circles around the same track to make it more spectator-friendly. So it in a sense, the domination that these Roche River teams had over the dog derby wound up being the demise of the dog derby itself, because teams weren't willing to come to Yellowknife anymore to compete, and that was what was driving the organizers to put together a dog derby of this magnitude. One of my earliest memories as a child with the sled dog team was hearing the sound of the bells. Now the dogs, they seem to be able to run to make music with these bells, and I remember being about 3 years old and sitting in the toboggan. Underneath me is my mom, maybe some of my siblings, and we're all wrapped up in my dad's feather blanket inside the toboggan. And I'm laying back in the toboggan. I'm looking up at a nice clear sky with the northern lights, and we're heading out to my dad's trap line, and the dogs are running and jingling those bells. The bells were an indication to the sled dogs. At the start of the winter, they would put bells on. It was a sign that they're heading out onto the trap line. And also, at Christmas time, they would put bells in the dogs when they were heading into town. And as soon as the dogs heard the bells ringing, they knew that they were going to get to go and have an extended rest over the Christmas season. And so they would get really excited when they heard those bells. The harnesses that the trappers used were straight line harnesses, we call them nowadays, or thick leather harnesses. They had to have straight line harness because they traveled on really thick, heavily wooded bush trails, and they're very windy. So they couldn't have dogs in the modern hitch side by side because of these windy wooded trails. So one dog would follow after each another, and they would all be hooked together with these long leather traces. The dog's head would go into the collar, and this here was called the back pad. That would go onto the dog's back. Now, at Christmas time, or maybe at carnival time, the trapper would decorate his back pad, they called it, or dog blanket. They would have fancy dog blankets like this with beaded or embroidered flowers, and they would cover up their regular back pads. This is a regular working back pad that we have underneath. But for special occasions, they would decorate their harnesses with these dog blankets. And they would also take the tail of one of the harder animals to catch, or one of the more valuable animals that they would catch. And they would take the tail from that animal and they would put it on their lead dog's harness. And that was an indication of how prosperous of a trapper you were. So if you could take the tail of, say, a wolverine, was a really common one, it showed a higher status for you and your dog team. And my dad said, whenever you met another trapper in a trap line, the first thing you look at is to see what kind of tail he has. Because if he's got wolverine, or this one here is Arctic fox, and in the 1940s, Arctic fox was a very valuable fur. It attracted trappers to the barren lands in the Arctic, and they were heading up there looking for these foxes. So having an Arctic fox would have been quite prestigious in the 1940s. The practical reason of these, they're called standing irons, is when the trapper is traveling, especially these trappers that went to the barren lands, they would have to find their direction on the land. And so with the tail of this animal, they would watch the wind direction by how it blew this tail and how it blew the ribbons that it had on top. So it was a very important piece of the equipment, but also an important decoration for the dogs. My dad told me one time that he shot a white-tailed deer, and there was no white-tailed deer at all around the Tolson River. And so he took that tail, it was brown on top and white on the bottom, and he curled it around and around this metal bar that's in the middle of the standing iron. And he said it looked almost like a candy cane curling up. And all of the other trappers, as I said, the first thing another trapper looks at when he meets a trapper in the trapline is what kind of standing iron tail does he have? And people were looking at that white-tailed deer tail, but a lot of the other trappers, they would touch it and they knew it was fur from an animal, but they couldn't guess what animal. And so my dad had a really special standing iron that winter. Now, most of the trappers before would carry one of these tools with them, a sled dog whip, but it wasn't used to beat dogs. What they were using it for is they would crack it and it would make a sharp noise, and that would scare the dogs into correcting bad behavior, or also to speed them up. But most of the trappers, they preferred not to use the whip. They would teach their dogs with voice control and with whistles. Like I talked earlier about my dad using the sound when the dogs were to chase an animal of sk. He used that sound. He used a variety of whistles, and then he also used commands. When he wanted the dogs to turn left, he would holler chaw, and the dogs would make a left-hand turn, or U for a right-hand turn. Now, if these guys were better dog trainers, you could also teach your dogs come chaw, which they would make a 180-degree turn and come straight back toward you, or come you would be the same thing, come back in the opposite direction. Now those commands there were important for, say, traveling on thin ice. If you had to get your dogs off of the ice as quick as you could, you would give them that command, come chaw, and they would come running right past you. But most of these trappers, they preferred to let their dogs do some of the thinking with them, and so that's how it was with my dad and his dog team. When they're traveling on ice, he would watch the leader, Sandy, and his ears. And Sandy would, as soon as the ice got too thin for them to travel on, Sandy would put his ears down and listen really closely to the sounds the ice was making under his feet. And that was the indication to my dad that the ice was getting too thin, and so they would have to head back into a different direction to get off of that dangerous ice. I asked my dad once about his dogs and Sandy and some of the things that they would have done to amaze him, and he said that every day at about midday they would make a fire camp. And so he would drive Sandy and the rest of the dogs into a really thick bush, because it was nice and sheltered and warm for them in a thick bush, and also there was lots of trees around to make a fire. And he would drive Sandy and the team right into that thick bush and make his fire, and the dogs would all lay around. They might get a snack during the fire camp. And when it was time for Papa, my dad, to leave, he would take his tea pail and he would empty the tea out of it, what was left of the tea. And Sandy would see this, and so Sandy would get up on his own, and he would shake all this, any snow that had accumulated on his fur, and the other dogs would do the same. And then Sandy would turn around, and he would start walking out of the bush. And the other dogs wouldn't turn at the same time because they were all connected by these traces, and they would get all tangled. And so the next dog, Dempsey, would wait until Sandy was all the way by him, and then Dempsey would turn, and he would start walking out of the bush. And one by one, these dogs would turn on their own. My dad hadn't said anything to him at this point, and they would turn themselves right out of the bush so they're ready to head back out onto the frozen lake. And once it got to the toboggan, my dad said he would just swing his toboggan around and grab on, and off they would head out onto the frozen lake and back onto the trap line. And it was one of the things that his dogs learned, one of the things that they did on their own without having to be taught or commanded to do. I learned these stories from my parents, Danny and Doris McQueen. I remember them because of the love and respect that I have for my parents, as well as the sled dogs that provided us transportation in the harsh northern winters. Like every young northern boy, I dreamed about being a trapper like my dad and having my own team of dogs. One of my earliest memories is riding in my dad's toboggan, covered over by a feather blanket made by my mother, being pulled by a strong team of sled dogs with bells on their backs jingling, making music. I've spent my lifetime working with sled dogs, learning to show them affection, care, and respect. These instincts are ingrained in me as they are with most members of my family. Just after my dad's death in 1997, I trained a team of sled dogs to race in the 1998 Canadian Championship Dog Derby in honor of my father. My daughter, Jordy James McQueen, competed in the 2005 Canadian Championship Dog Derby in memory of her grandfather. She received an award for the Danny McQueen Memorial for the top NWT rookie. My son, Tolson McQueen, anxiously awaits his chance to compete in the Dog Derby. He continues to learn how to raise dogs, how to work with them, how to show them affection, respect, and how to care for them. This DVD explains where this passion for sled dogs comes from, but you'll have to wait for the next DVD to hear more stories about Danny McQueen and his Derby dogs.